Hello from Ottawa, where I'm visiting my oldest son and his family. Um, my wife and I were wandering around downtown Ottawa on Tuesday, and we came across St. Patrick's Church. And we went inside, and the service was underway. So we sat down in the pews, and it was just before the gospel reading. And the gospel was read, and the priest stood up and preached his sermon. And it was less than 5 minutes. So inspired by that, I'm going to try to keep my talk short. Because I'm Canadian, I'm going to start out with some apologies. Firstly, I don't have any slides. Lawyers in Canada don't use slides. They're not used in court. I think the main reason is that in oral argument, you need to get to the heart of a matter, and if you use slides, it's a little difficult to do so. Secondly, I want to apologize for my lack of familiarity with other liturgies. I know we have Anglicans and Lutherans and Roman Catholics in the class, and I don't know much about their liturgies, and I'm hoping to learn more through the discussion. And lastly, I apologize because I too am going to use sports metaphors during my discussion. And I was glad that they've been used already. I felt like it opened a bit of a door for me. Anyway, my talk is on Susan Wood's article entitled Participatory Knowledge of God in the Liturgy. And if my Google search is accurate, she's the academic dean of Regis College, which is the Jesuit college, which is part of the Toronto School of Theology. So she's from Father Jeffrey's neck of the woods, as I understand it. And I understand she's a member of the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, and obviously a gifted writer and academic, if you've, which comes across if you've read her article. So the thesis of her article is that participating in the liturgy gives us access to a certain kind of knowledge of God, which she identifies as participatory knowledge. That's the key phrase, participatory knowledge. Now, this raises a number of questions. Firstly, what does she mean by the liturgy? Her reference is mainly to the Eucharistic liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church, but her concept of liturgy is much broader. I would say it's the sequence of prayers, hymns, Bible readings, and sacraments, especially the Eucharist, which the community of believers participate in on a regular basis. And the community participation is very key in her argument as well. Another question is, in what sense can we know God? Now, Susan Wood says participatory knowledge is not knowledge about God, but knowledge of God. In other words, it is not knowing God in his essence, which is impossible. Rather, participatory knowledge is about knowing God in relationship. It is a relational knowledge and understanding. So another question is, what is meant by participatory knowledge? And I think here analogies can help. And one of my questions is going to be to ask you to relate your own experience by analogy. For me, when I look back, I see law school as a place where I was taught to think like a lawyer. And then after law school, you have a 1-year articling period. It's like an apprenticeship. And I viewed that as where I was taught how to act like a lawyer. And then looking back, I always felt that the first 4 or 5 years when I participated in the practice of law was when I learned to become a lawyer. And I have have also curled a lot over the years. I realize some of you may not be familiar with the game, but in my teenage years, I became interested in curling, and I read all I could about it. And I also curled with people with a lot of experience and ability. But it wasn't until I actually started competing as a curler that I learned how to be a competitive curler. And then it took many years of practice and competition before I was able to compete at the highest level. I needed to participate for a long, long time. And lately I've taken up triathlons. And I've done a couple of Ironman races in the last 3 years. And before those races, I read up as much as I could about what it meant to do an Ironman race. Read all the theory and studied a bunch of training material and even hired a coach. But I can say for sure, until I'd done a couple of Ironman races, I didn't really know what the race was all about. So again, I had to participate to know what it meant to become an Ironman. So definitely participation is the key with respect to becoming a lawyer or a competitive curler or an Ironman triathlete. So this raises the question, what do we become by participating in the liturgy? What does it mean to know God in relation? And this is where we get to the heart of the matter. And Susan Wood draws on the writings of Michael Poliani in analyzing what it means to have participatory knowledge. And she uses the metaphor of the face to examine what it ought to be, what our goal ought to be. And she explains that the key is not to focus on the features of the face if we want to get to know the face. We have to focus on the face as a whole. In other words, we shouldn't focus on the eyes, nose, or ears. We have to see the face as a whole. On page 36, she writes, with respect to the liturgy, we must ask, what is the face known in the liturgy? What is the whole? The answer is the paschal mystery of salvation in Christ Jesus. This is the whole, which gives meaning to all of the liturgy. And on page 48, she writes, the test of true liturgy and true knowledge of God is how they form and transform us to live outside the liturgy, how they form and transform us to live outside the liturgy. And that forming and transforming, I think, is why this article is here, since this is what this course is about. So the key point is that participation in the liturgy should have a transformative effect. But what does that look like? From God's point of view, what does He want more than anything through our participation in the liturgy? And I think the answer from the Bible is clear. He wants us to love Him with all our heart and mind and soul. That is the goal that's most dear to God's heart. And yet, there's no direct mention of this in Susan Wood's article. She does say this on page 51. She says, quote, conversion results in charity, which is to say love, which unites us to God. Mariton notes that John of St. Thomas's great achievement was to show that in mystical experience, the love grows into an objective means of knowing, which unites the intellect with the thing known, unquote. But she doesn't identify loving God as the main goal of the liturgy, which is what I would argue ought to be the main goal of the liturgy, is loving God. And why? Because if participation in the liturgy leads us to love God, then we will know God, for God is love. That is the whole. That is the face. Indeed, the face of God is love. So thanks for listening. I'm going to pose some questions, and I look forward to our discussion.